Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, to this Food Learning Forum session, Introduction to Local Government. It's a pleasure to see you all. So I'm Sofia Parent. I'm head of local action at Sustain, and the session will cover the outlook and types of local government in England and how to influence. Thank you very much for sending your questions in advance. I think that really helped us and the speakers to tailor the presentations to the themes you're most interested in. So the program for today, we're going to start with a presentation about local government in England from Rebecca Cox. She's the Principal Policy Advisor at the Local Government Association. So this will be about the nuts and bolts of local government in England. Then we'll get an inside view of local government from Emily O'Brien. She's councillor in the Lewes District Council, and she's also deputy chair of the People and Places Board at the Local Government Association. And finally, we're going to hear from Vic Bowrill. She's the director of Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, and she'll give us an example of working with council staff and elected councillors in Brighton and Hove. And this will be followed by 25 minutes or so for your questions. So because this is a meeting, it will be nice if you raise your hands using the reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to you for your questions. So without further ado, Rebecca, do you want to take us through the nuts and bolts of local government? Thank you.
I will do my very best to get the key facts across without drowning you in detail. So hopefully this will find a good middle ground. I'm hoping everyone's got the slides. Yep. Oh, always stressful to start the day was sharing your screen in front of such a brilliant bunch of people. So I'm glad that it's all come up.
Good, Rebecca.
So, hi, as Sophia said, my name is Rebecca Cox. I'm Principal Policy Advisor at the Local Government Association. So we are a membership body for councils in England and Wales. So I'm going to run you through a little bit about the very basics of local government, what it is, what it does, how it's funded, how decisions are made, and some of the big changes that we're looking at in the future. And obviously it's a particularly auspicious day to be doing that. Just walked in past the House of Parliament. The media village is kind of set up on College Green as we wait to hear the Chancellor's autumn statement today, which will give us a kind of a look ahead at public services and public finances for the next few months or year, depending on how things go next year. So what do councils do? So councils are the most local decision-making bodies in the kind of wider governance of the United Kingdom. I'm not talking so much about town and parish councils, those very much most local decision-making bodies. I'm talking mainly about the ones that you'll come across. The classic is emptying your bins, filling the potholes, doing all those things that you come across every day. But you might not know that there are about 800 or even more public services that councils deliver. And that in amongst that, there's 1,200 legal duties. And I think there's often an understanding that if something is a statutory duty or a legal duty, councils are funded to do that fully, and unfortunately that's just not the case, and it does lead to some very difficult decisions about where money goes, which we'll come on to in a little bit. So you've got on the slide there some of the things that covers. It really is kind of the A to Z, the birth to death services, and also includes things like cultural services, parks, transport, highways, a whole range of things that they do. So if you're in a city, if you're in London or you're in Manchester, I saw someone from Bury in the chat, generally speaking, you've got one council. Outside of the main cities, you might have two. So you might have a district or a borough council and then a county council, and they split different functions between them. I think Emily might talk a little bit about that later. I'll talk a bit more again later in some city regions and now more broadly outside that as well. There are some, I've called them sub-national strategic authorities, very techie policy language, apologies, but they have slightly more strategic powers than councils, but they're not a national body. So you might have heard of the Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, Sadiq Khan in London, and there are a whole host of others as well. 9,000 or a bit more parish councils, And broadly, English local government, we hear a lot about the NHS as a big workforce and a big kind of force in the public sector, but local government's up there too. So around 20,000 democratically elected councillors, over 2 million employees, and around about £50 billion spent every year. So if you add all of that up, potentially that is a big force for change. What does that look like on a map? Civil servants, when I talk to them, the ones who do understand local government, always have itchy fingers to try and make this map really tidy and align lots of administrative boundaries. But it is, there's a lot going on. It reflects history, it reflects local identity, it reflects some practical sort of travel to work areas and things like that. So it's not a perfect map. It does, it is something that we just work with and haven't quite managed to fit on very easily the Isles of Scilly. They're kind of squeezed in there at the bottom. How is local government funded? Well, it's from a range of sources. It used to be, I think, slightly more straightforwardly, a lot of that came directly from government. It's now more broadly made up of government grants, ring-fenced, or so for specific purposes, or more generally, council tax and fees and charges. The biggest part of that still, I think, is council tax and business rates. But overall, budgets have been really under pressure since the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, it's a really well-worn thing. Hopefully, you'll have heard that message loud and clear through the LGA and others, and you'll have felt it, I'm sure, where you live locally as well. Our latest calculations show that councils face a funding gap of over £4 billion over the next 2 years. So that's a gap between what they have to deliver and what they can, and the funding that they've got available to fix it. To pay for that. By 24-25, those cost and demand pressures will have added £15 billion to the cost of delivering council services since 21-22. So that's just a standstill. It's just got that much more expensive across the country. And it's not a straightforward way to get the money to fund that either. Lots of what government makes available to us is in single funds. We have to compete for them. Our member councils have to compete for them. They can be for something as small as, I don't know, getting chewing gum off the roads, or getting changing places, toilets, or they can be really big. So it could be transport, or you might have heard yesterday that the third round of the Levelling Up Fund was announced, which is pots of sort of £20 million to do particular projects in places. And that takes a lot of time for councils to figure out what government wants, how will it fit with what councils want to do? Do they have the time to bid for it? Do they think it's viable? Is their MP on board? Like, there's a lot to do. It's not just, putting in a form and then some money comes out the other end, as I'm sure Emily and colleagues know all too well. I wanted to go forward with it. So in a graphic form, and I've borrowed this from our colleagues at New Local, you can see that there's quite a split of how that funding comes through. What does that look like in reality? So we did some analysis that looked at, if you had £1 of council funding, how is that divvied up? How is that spent? And the main thing I want to draw your attention to is from 2012 to 13 to 10 years later in 22, 23, how much on the right-hand side, children's social care and adult social care, which are two huge and really important statutory responsibilities for local government, have increased and are putting pressure on all those other budgets. So things like roads, planning, cultural services, housing, central services, so those are key things that councils do, making sure that your takeaway is healthy and doesn't, there's no mice running around it. All of that is really squeezed down, and you can see just how much of a bigger proportion those pressures from children's and adult social care are making. That's only going to go up as well. We know, especially post-COVID, demand, particularly for children's services, is really on the rise. So when you've got all those pressures and all those responsibilities, how do you make decisions about where to spend the money, what to prioritise, how you work with your local community, businesses and other public services to do it? Councils are run by our elected politicians. That can be a single party, it could be a coalition. We're increasingly seeing more of those at the moment. But they will have to have some kind of central structure to make those decisions in line with the council's own constitution. So that could be what's called a leader in cabinet, where very similar to what you see with the Prime Minister and ministers in Westminster. It can be a committee system, which is a more kind of delegated or shared out way of making decisions. You might see some who have a directly elected mayor. So the borough that I live in, Lewisham in London, We have a directly elected mayor, so it's not from the leading party or the agreed party that we get a chance to elect that mayor, elect that mayor directly. Or in some cases where the council's in difficulties, the Secretary of State may have prescribed some arrangements as well. And if you want to find out more about how your local council is run, it should be on the website. Look out for the Constitution and it can tell you all of the detail of how those decisions are made, when their general meetings are, when budgets are set, and all of that detail as well. I'm not going to linger on this because you'll have the slides for later. Just a little bit about the LGA, who we are and what we do. I've talked a little bit about some of the different kinds of decision making in the UK, and particularly in England. If you look at us across, it's usually the OECD or colleagues in Europe, we are incredibly centralised. The powers that councils have to make decisions and the abilities they have to raise their own funding are really, really limited if you take an international view. So in England, we recently had a review by the Council of Europe who said, there's been some good progress made. You've started to see these new arrangements where there are combined authorities who have some more powers, but it's still patchwork across the country. Those deals still have to be agreed with central government. There's no kind of centrally agreed understanding of what we like to call subsidiarity. How can you make the most local decision, the decisions at the most locally appropriate level? And we think the government could go a lot further on that. And that's something that we're really pleased to see progress on, but we do think there could be a lot more. There's a map there of some of the combined authorities and devolution areas. If you look at Cornwall and others, there'll be some more announcements today, we expect, including looking at new models that don't require an elected mayor and that are outside of the main cities. So quite a lot of change potentially coming there as well. What does that look like? I know some questions came in about what powers do combined authorities have versus what powers do councils have. They tend to be more in what we kind of broadly think of as kind of economic growth regeneration kind of space. So around skills and employment support, growth funding, transport, housing. Again, Manchester has some of the classic examples. You've seen the B network, as they're calling it, the ability to do things like smart ticketing across all of your public transport, to have control over your bus services, and to be able to sort of join that up in an integrated way. Some deals also have some elements of public service reform, health, justice, police and crime. Some mayors are police and crime commissioners as well. There's a bit of progress in standardizing deals, but it still largely comes down on a lot of negotiation between the places, government, and all the different departments. And there's a little bit more detail about deals there, which you can look at later, but I'm conscious of not taking up too much time. So where next? Those long-term financial challenges remain. We're getting by year budgets allocated from government just on yearly chunks as well. So that long-term planning is really difficult. We still expect pressure on services to increase. And councils are facing challenges in recruitment and retention as well. So there's a capacity challenge for councils up against the private sector who might be able to pay more than we can as well. There's a lot of joint working that we need to do with government. And it's particularly on those really big cross-cutting issues where no one of us can solve this alone. We all need to be acting together and we all need to have a common understanding of what we're trying to do. Climate change is a classic one, but also things like social care and how it's connected to the NHS and others. It's been good to see as we get closer to an eventual general election sometime next year, that there is a commitment to greater local empowerment across the political spectrum. And I think it's been really helpful to be able to have those conversations with different political parties, with civil servants for the LGA on behalf of local government about what could we do better on behalf of the country if we could do more locally and if we were a bit better funded to do some of that as well. So, the proof will be in the pudding of whatever manifestos we're working to after the general election, but some positive noises there. And of course, empowering local decision isn't just about councils, it's about communities through and with councils as well. And that shared understanding of what the local challenges and priorities are will be really important in informing whatever, for example, we say as the LGA, or those conversations with government as and when it comes in as well. So I think everybody on this call has probably got a really important role to play in shaping their local places and making the case for more local decision making as well. So happy to pick up questions, obviously, at the end of this, or I've put a few links in the slides as well where you can go to find out a bit more information or follow what happens today with Autumn Statement, or anything else around local government. Thanks, Sophia.
Thank you, Rebecca. Really useful. And start thinking about your questions for Rebecca and the other speakers. But Emily, give us your inside view now as a councillor in a district council.
Thanks, Sophia. I should probably declare an interest here that I'm a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper. So I've seen this world from lots of different perspectives. I've been a council officer back in the past, many years ago, in both sort of big urban unitary and very small borough council, where they actually used to come around with a tea trolley at tea time. So back in the old days of councils. I've also worked on I know some of the people here from my many years working around the food partnership world. So I worked for a food partnership, then for sustainable food places for over 10 years altogether. So as well as doing sort of more on the ground food stuff. So I've kind of come to being a councillor later in life, having worked around the food world. So I'm very much given the perspective, having I should say I have a bit of a foot in both camps. So just to put that on the table. I'm not going to talk with slides, but because I think actually what might be helpful is if I chip in with some of the questions and just give that perspective. But I've just got kind of 3 key points really about engaging with councils and talking to councillors. I think the first thing that I wanted to say is just to reiterate what Rebecca put so well, really, is that we used to live in this world where councils were quite well funded, you know, and they were institutional, you know, a lot of councils, they had the tea trolley coming round, or maybe since they were quite well staffed, but we have gone way beyond that world. And as councils, we are really, really strapped for cash. So I think it's quite frustrating as a councillor when, you know, I've done this myself, you know, you're out there and you're sort of having a chat up on your lovely gardening project, where you think, well, council could fund this. And there's that kind of expectation that we have all this money, whereas actually, interestingly, compared to when I used to work as a council officer, being a councillor now is much more like working in one of the voluntary organisations, community organisations. We have to be really agile and really careful with our money and really smart about how we work. And we just don't have that kind of spare capacity that I think there's a sort of perception there can be. So I suppose my sort of first key point is actually sort of, as a councillor, I get loads of people coming to me with their problems, you know, everything from your local residents that you've been elected to represent with their planning issues, their potholes, everything, even stuff that's outside of our control as a district council. I mean, I have nothing to do with potholes and I still get all the pothole queries. But also, you know, those bigger kind of problems. You know, we have this huge issue with food poverty, all these things that I'm really passionate about myself as a councillor. And I suppose what's really tricky is when people come to me with problems, but I don't have the answers. I don't have the money, and in fact, I don't have the powers. As Rebecca set out, councils have quite limited powers, and we are the most centralised country in Europe in terms of the lack of powers we have as local government. We don't even get to set the levels of council tax. We don't even get to set the levels on our council housing anymore, for the rent we charge. A lot of our stuff is centrally controlled, semi-disguised as local control. So what really helps me as a councillor is if you turn up at my door and say, we've got this terrible problem and I've got a solution around it, and can you help me with that solution? And I think that's something that we also, you know, I'm seeing Vic smiling as well, because, you know, this is a third partnership person, is to go to people with some answers, not just with problems, because it's quite hard to fix some of the things. And I think we have a lot less power and resource than people realise. I think so. That's my sort of first kind of key tip, isn't it? Is to help us to help you. I think the second thing that's really important to think about is, I think, you know, when I was on the outside of councils, I think I just saw the council as the council. And actually, as Rebecca said, we're quite complicated. I think a lot of people don't actually understand the difference between councillors and council officers. I don't know if there's anyone, sorry if I'm saying this, everybody here knows this. But as a councillor, so I'm largely a volunteer, really. I get an allowance, because I'm in quite a small council. I'm a district council, so that's one of the rural ones. I get a bit of an allowance, which isn't a full wage, and I get some extra allowance because I'm part of the the party which is in administration. So we're running the council and I'm a cabinet member in that. So I get a bit more because of that. But actually I'm largely a volunteer with some, with an allowance to cover that. And I'm only elected for 4 years at a time. Being re-elected depends on people wanting to vote for me. And I direct the council. So I'm in charge as a cabinet member. My portfolio is climate, nature, and food systems, as I've rather grandly called it. And the food systems in there because we want to do something around food systems. But so in theory, I'm like the boss, and everybody works for me. But actually, anybody who's ever worked with councillors knows that actually it's not quite as straightforward as that. So we set the strategic direction. All the work is done by the council officers, and they are a bit like civil servants. They're there all the time. Some of them are really well paid at the senior level. The kind of lead, the chief executive of the council is pretty good, and all those senior people. Some of them aren't. They're just public sector wages have not kept up, and they're really hard pressed. So just don't think of us the same thing. And if you're approaching us in our political, as a councillor, just be aware we're part of the political party thing as well. So different messages are going to resonate with different political parties. I happen to be a Green councillor, and we're in joint administration with Labour. And so those messages about climate, about social justice, I absolutely love hearing that. Bring me solutions on that, no problem at all. I think some of my Conservative colleagues, it's worth going to them with messages about the economy, about skills. Remember the food sector is 1 in 8 jobs in this country, and some local stats about the economy. So think about where we're sitting if you're approaching us as councillors. What are our values? What will appeal to us? And I think the other thing is sometimes you run across councillors, don't you, at events and things, but just have a think about where they sit, because actually being an opposition councillor is really, really different than being in control, being in power. So I'm in power, so I have the power to do things, to make stuff happen. I say, make this happen, and about 10% of the time it actually does, so I'm in theory, the boss. But it's But actually, if you've met someone and they're in opposition, and particularly if it's like a cabinet system like ours, they don't necessarily have the ability to do that. What they're good at is then campaigning and holding to account. And if you've got something that perhaps will resonate, particularly if they've got an election coming up and want to make it an election issue, that's quite a good way of raising something up. But it's also not going to win you any friends with the people who are in administration potentially. So just have a think about it from that point of view. Don't treat councillors and officers the same, and don't treat the people in administration and the people in opposition the same. So that was my second top tip. My third top tip is just to remember that as councillors, we are so shallow. I mean, we are so deeply shallow. And if you want us to turn up to something, ask us to open it, cut a ribbon, be a speaker if there's an event and we're not too random. Some of us are really, really random. So, I mean, my top tip is to kind of, we love opportunities to make us look good. Most of us have to write regular newsletters that go out to our residents, or the hardworking ones among us anyway. So we need copy for that. We're expected, with very little money really, we're expected to, in this modern world, not only kind of run the council, but we also got social media accounts to run. People expect answers at the drop of a hat. They kind of ring us up or send us texts out, the weekend, and they're expecting an immediate answer. So things that help us to kind of have a public profile and look good occasionally, because most of the time people just moan at us. We get everybody's problems. So anything that helps us to look good, we love. So if you want us to come to an event, invite us there in some kind of VIP capacity, and we are there at the drop of a hat. So I think that's my third tip, is do not underestimate the shallowness and our willingness to court publicity. And I think those are my 3 top tips, but I'm hoping I can come in on some of the questions and say something there.
Thank you so much. I was at the edge of my seat, I have to say, with your top tips. I hope everyone feels the same. So Vic, you're next. You're going to talk to us about your experience of working closely with the Brighton and Hove Council. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm just checking. Is that okay? Can you see that one all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not full screen at the moment.
Oh, I could lose it in the process of trying to get full screen, couldn't I? Hang on a minute. Let's see what I can do quickly. I'm going to just go out of it and come back in again. Sorry. Is that still not full screen?
If you start presentation mode.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, happy days.
Excellent. Thank
Right,
you.
I'm going to zip through this fairly quickly because I know everyone's got time for questions. And Emily and I make such a great double act due to the fact that the food partnership that she used to work for that she mentioned was actually the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership. Before I get into the context of it, I just wanted to really quickly say something about the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, because we are quite different to quite a lot of other places across the country in that, as well as our work at a strategy and policy level and a partnership level, we also deliver services directly to individuals. We teach people cookery, we run composting projects, we work with groups such as community food projects. And the reason I say this is because we see all this policy and strategy work as part of this overall picture across the different elements of what we do. So I'm going to apologize to some of our community researchers on this call today, I know, and they've already seen this presentation once, so you'll just have to smile and nod through this bit. I do often say all the reasons not to policy influence and not to work with your local authority, because actually it is quite hard work, right? And particularly it's time consuming, it's unattractive to funders. Something that I think I put in here is this political neutrality thing. For us as an organisation, political neutrality is really important. I've been at the Food Partnership 15 years, and in that time, I've worked under a Conservative-led administration, a Labour-led, a Green-led, a Labour-led, a Conservative. You know, it rotates, it changes. For the very first time this year, we have gone to a majority-led administration, and that has actually been a massively significant change. So as well as the kind of things that Rebecca and Emily have mentioned about understanding what sort of authority you are, we're a unitary authority, I would also look at the makeup of your administration, because that also plays out. My other one is my learning a whole new language policy. I've still not learned it, so thank you, Rebecca. I just had another few little bits I picked up from your presentation there. However, I would say we have always done policy influence, and the reason is because it is really important. The challenges and opportunities faced by the people we work with are actually directly linked to local and national government decisions. I am looking today to see what happens about Household Support Fund in the autumn statement, because this will have a huge impact on what happens going ahead in terms of our work with people in poverty in the city. The advantage of policy change, though, is it's often long lasting. And the reason I've put up the Marine Stewardship Council fish one is many years ago, our school meal service decided to serve only MSC certified fish, right? This was before a lot of procurement work happened. And that means week in, week out on a Friday, fish is always served on a Friday for some reason in school meals. Every single portion of fish that's served is MSC certified. That is actually just this long-term change, because whilst policy takes a long time to change in one direction, it takes a long time to change back in the other. So once you've got it in, it's actually a really good place to be. And I've also kind of, just because I wanted to have a little smile of putting this fantastic picture with some people in vegetables and our mayor, it's also can sometimes take small ideas and take it to a game-changing level. Sugar Smart as an idea actually started in Brighton and Hove quite a few years ago, and then got picked up and replicated. The Jamie Oliver Foundation did work on it. Sustain have done work on it. And I just say sometimes things can really, really build momentum. One of the questions that came in prior to this presentation was about your sphere of influence, or about how do you know where to work? We do most of our work at a Brighton and Hove City Council level. There is a lot you can influence around food that actually operates at a unitary authority level. We do some work at the regional level, and we do some work at national, but that is actually usually about adding our support or our data, our case studies, our experience to what national campaigning organisations are doing. Every now and then we completely leapfrog that. For example, and I mentioned Household Support Fund earlier, when about a year ago, one of the tranches of Household Support Fund came out with a 33% ring fence for older people. Brighton and Hove doesn't have 33% of its population that's older people. We have an awful lot of different people in need. And we joined with other local authorities such as Liverpool, the LGA, to do some direct influencing around locally determined priorities, not nationally determined ones. So every now and then, as I say, we take our effort and try and influence nationally. Although we are increasingly working at a national level, because the groups we support are asking us to share their experiences. And I just sort of say the ways we do this, we write to government, we respond to consultations, we do media interviews, and as I say, we join with others. I just wanted to step back a bit though and think about who influences policy, because this sort of very much follows on to what Emily said about understanding the difference between a civil servant, local authority officer, and politicians and councillors. I also want to throw into the mix though, there are other people that influence policy, celebrities, right? Think tanks, academics, and local groups like ours. And I suppose for me, it's just about remembering, thinking where you are in the mix and what you can add to the overall picture. So how do you know where to start? How do you know what to try to influence? This was another question that came in, okay? Another analogy some of you've seen me do before. I think it's a game of Jenga, because I genuinely think, right, there's all these food policies that you could influence, and you have to find the right time for the right one. You have to go around and you have to tap. And sometimes you get really surprised because something that's not moved for 10 years, it's suddenly the time to go with. So I think staying across things is really important. But I also think it doesn't have to be huge, right? Sometimes it can be a really small change, right? And I'm going to go back to Emily here and say she wants solutions, you know, groups that want to be able to grow together on an allotment site. And Brighton and Hove had to go to the bottom of the waiting list. We did a little bit of influencing to say, if it's a community group, so therefore lots of people are joining, can there be some sort of priority process for them? And it's like, it's a solution for a problem as opposed to a big problem. On the completely opposite end of the scale, the Brighton and Hove planning advice note on food growing was a really long-term piece of policy work that took a lot of time. Both are really important because both are about gaining momentum. I think it's really important to find things that you and your local authority want to work on together. Uptake of Healthy Start was something our public health team cared about. It's something we cared about, right? And one of the tricks we did with this, and by the way, whoever put in the question, why is there not just auto enrollment? I totally agree with you. This is like all the time and effort that goes into this is utter madness. But one of the things we did with the Healthy Start campaign was we actually, rather than talking about percentages, which was what everybody was doing previously, is we started talking about how many families we needed to find. Okay, so we started off, I think back when we did this in January, that was a sort of 800 and something families needed to be found, and now we've got it down to 476. I just think sometimes that way of looking at things differently and really galvanizing people together can be helpful. The other thing we do is we put food goggles over things that come out. So if there is a piece of I don't know, consultation about transport or economic development, just go on there. The forms are usually pretty quick. Shove something in about food. If you do it often enough, if you go to meetings often enough and wave your arm in the air, people eventually will put food in just to make you go away. If you want to go on a completely massive, bigger step, obviously having your own local area food strategy and action plan. I put action plan in really big capitals because if it doesn't have action in, I think people lose enthusiasm and momentum for it. I'm really not going to go very much into this because Sustainable Food Places framework is the model to follow, is basically the way to go with this. The only thing I'm going to say is that the process is as important as the document. A top-down process will come up with top-down answers. The grassroots process will come up with really community-embedded answers. So what do we do to influence policy? As I say, I've always touched on maintaining political neutrality. I think it's really important. We share our data and stories. Just reuse what you've already got. You don't have to go and it's like you're basically shining a spotlight on something through what you know. Do, however, perhaps group them in the overarching themes that your local policymakers use, right? If your remit is to deal with obesity, then that's the thing we need to be talking about. I think using the democratic process, going to questions to council, although bearing in mind what Emily says about not annoying people too much, creating tools and templates, borrow them from other places, infographics, right? I've done the wheelie bin one way with compost because I could produce you a 5-page briefing on this, or I can just do an infographic that, as Emily says, you can share on social media. It is all about relationships though, and this does take time. I'm not going to kid you. It's like you sort of have to go to things, you have to talk to people, you have to put yourself out there, and that can make people quite uncomfortable sometimes. Coming towards the end here, I guess the last thing to say is the power of personal stories. Without being exploitative, sometimes a person's story can be so illuminating when you're trying to actually get something to change. We've just published our annual Emergency Food Network survey, and there's actually a story of a student in that as the case study. And let me tell you, the universities have been getting in touch with us. There's been quite a lot of response because that was put from a different perspective. We also take part in a larger policy and research project, which is called Food Sequels, which I can never ever say, which is a UKRI funded project. It's a really, really big piece of work with lots and lots of different universities. We're involved in it. And that is one where it's definitely, you have to be in it for the long game. You have to think, yes, I'm participating in something which will not show fruit quickly. I'm not going to read all of these. This will all be shared, but I think one of the things we all as a whole network have to keep doing is, while single issue asks are always easiest, we have to keep the message about it being a whole food systems approach, because that's almost where our power as a network comes. And remember, policymakers are humans. They have their own food beliefs. You have to be a little bit mindful, perhaps, when talking to one of Brighton's vegan councillors about the need for the local abattoirs as part of local food infrastructure. I think it's just really, really careful who you say and what you say. And actually remember to tell people what happened. If people have stuck their neck out and gone and helped you, it's like, again, it's the little things that help. So I'm stopping sharing my screen there. I did that really sort of gabbly quick because I really wanted to have some questions, because I think between us all, we might be able to pick up some of the things that came in earlier.
Thank you, Vic. Really, really useful to have your experience. So get ready for your questions. I think the easiest thing is put your hand up and we'll get to you. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to ask you to fill in a feedback form before you leave the meeting, because it will really help us to improve the quality of future sessions. And I'll give you a reminder closer to the end, or several reminders. So while you think about your questions, again, feel free to put your hands up. Chair's privilege. So in the questions you sent with your registration, quite a lot of people were interested in exploring different powers that local authorities have or don't have, and the limits of those powers. And there was quite a few things that people wanted to see more powers, more levers at the disposal of local authorities. So in your opinion, Rebecca, Emily and Vic, what would be the game changer, the power that local authorities currently don't have, that would really, really make a huge difference in terms of transforming the food system? Or maybe it's something they already have, but they're not using it. Emily.
Well, I think there's a couple of different levels of answer to that, isn't there? I mean, I think generally one of the things that frustrates me is that local authorities are often doing amazing work. So, for instance, if we look at climate change, of which, food and climate is so intimately connected in the way we look at that. Most local authorities have declared a climate emergency, and some of them, not all of them, but have committed to real action on the back of that. And we're not going to reach our local targets. So for my local authority, we have a 2030 target, but we're not even going to reach the government's 2050 target if we don't empower local authorities to be able to do the brilliant stuff they do, bringing people together, and taking action at a local level, helping to kind of join up the dots. And so I suppose the big answer to the question is to give local authorities the actual power, rather than holding it centrally and we having to kindly put our hands up and say, please, can we do this? And that's a genuinely cross-party ask. It's a very strong local government association ask, and so Rebecca would say the same on that. Is to just give us the power. So we've got two gaps, basically. We haven't got the money. We need proper funding settlements that are long term, and we haven't got the powers. We would like to do things and we can't, because they don't lie within our responsibility. And then a slightly sort of shorter answer is what one thing that will make a difference is, I know there are a couple of questions came in ahead of the session around planning. I sometimes describe planning as a national system disguised as local control. And I do, as someone who's worked I actually worked on the planning project that Vic mentioned, which over many years influencing a local authority's planning system to enable food growing within that local authority. And it's something that I've taken a lead on in my own authority as a councillor and said, you know, our next local plan, we want the strongest possible policies around enabling food growing. So, you know, it's something that we'd really like to be able to do things on, but actually it's really difficult to make local policy because it is always trumped by national policy, and the national policy is always moving the goalposts. So I think one particular area where actually it makes sense to give the control to local areas is around planning, because every area is different. And we should be, as an elected representative, to our electorate over how we do planning, not accountable to central government who doesn't know my local area. So a longer answer and a shorter answer there.
Thank you. I don't know if Rebecca or Vic, you want to add anything here? I bet you do.
Well, yeah, Emily set that out really well. And I think sometimes as well, it's, yes, we will always campaign for more powers, because we really genuinely believe that often that just leads to better outcomes. You know, it's hard to get the case studies because government doesn't like letting go very much, but when they do, it almost always has a positive result. But it doesn't always have to be about local powers being devolved. So thinking in that climate change space, sometimes what we want is just to be in the room with government, making those big decisions about what are the priorities and how will we action them. So that there is a long-term national plan. It's joined up across government. It considered local places and their local differences and their, you know, challenges and opportunities that they all have, so that when councils and all their partners and all of you come to be taking action on it, it works and it's joined up with what else is going on and it's not cutting across things. So sometimes it is that collaborative early engagement, probably similar things you would ask of your councils, right? Oh, just come and talk to us before you do things in our space, because we know how it works and we can tell you how it will work better. Some of our messaging up to government is similar on that. And also don't get stuck on pilots. I think government often feels like it's made a change when it's done a pilot. So again, in the climate space, there's just been a couple of retrofit pilots where some combined authorities have been able to join up funding and abilities around retrofit for homes. Can we just, you know, let's move on. Okay, let's take that learning really quickly and roll it out. So sometimes it's cultures and way of working changes as much as it is powers.
Thank you. Vic, would you like to add anything? Shall we move on? Let's move on to the next question. Optionally, you can put questions in the chat, as some of you are already doing. So this one is interesting because we work on specific issues. So in terms of food and public health. So question for Rebecca: where does food or public health sit in the expenditure pie chart you shared, which showed local government spending? So where do they meet?
So food, I think you would see kind of probably dotted throughout different policy areas. In terms of public health, there is a specific public health grant, and I was just looking up our latest figures on it, because I know the messaging is it keeps getting cut. The latest analysis we've got is there's been a £770 million real terms reduction in funding between 2015-16 and 22-23, and putting that in context, that's £17.06 less per person in real terms. And the challenges around that are obviously that we'll touch on food, but it's all things prevention, so a huge dip for councils. I can't quantify the food thing, I'm really sorry, because I think it does just cut across a lot of them, but it won't be getting bigger, I'm afraid.
That's the challenge, I think, for all of us. Another question.
Sophia, can I just come in on public health as well? Just to say, because I think it's public health is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's one of those things that's moved around a lot. So public health used to not sit with local authorities at all. It was brought into local authorities. And in unitary authorities, like where Vic is working, that's a very different picture than it is in many of the more, they're not always that rural, but the more rural areas, the non-big cities, like where I'm a councillor. So because I'm a district councillor with abilities for housing and planning, which are two of the main ways in which you determine health, aren't they? They're kind of some of the key determinants of public health is your housing and your planning system. How you design your places and how you and what the housing that people live in. But actually public health sits with our county council, who's working across then several different districts and boroughs. So it can be quite fragmented and it can be quite challenging, I think. So so I suppose I would say one of the things you know, to think about with public health is making sure you're addressing your questions to the right authority. It's a bit like when people write into me about school meals, and it's like, well, I'm a district councillor, we don't have school meals, we're not education, that's the county council. So I suppose it's worth just, although it's really sad, isn't it, that you have to make the effort to understand local government in order to relate to local government. And I think, why is it all so complicated is the question that comes to mind. It's a bit bonkers, but actually it does really help to just understand that if you're asking somebody to do something, is to be really clear about where the responsibility sits. But also, it can be that it's also about finding your champions, isn't it? So, I quite often talk to people about things like school meals because I've met them through foodie type things, and actually can help them to address those questions in a way to the county council, because I also know the functioning of the county council, which I should say is a very different political colour to my own council. So I've got some quite good insights into how some of that stuff can be addressed. So yeah, it was just a little ad there, Sophia.
Thank you. And Vic, maybe you would like to tell us what changes you've seen, because you've been working in the sector for so many years. So what changes have you seen in terms of how food and public health are delivered in the council?
I mean, I guess one of the things I was actually just going to pick up on Kinza's question as well, which is just on the chat, because I think it echoes what Emily says. The point about what levers are available to the local authority entirely depends on what the nature of that local authority is and what sort of powers they have. And it's like, it is a bit dull, but you sort of, if you're going to influence in your own local area, you just need to get to understand all those different parts, because as I say, your limited effort that you have to work on this is needs to be wisely pushed. And I've actually just put another note in the chat as well. So keep your eye on your integrated care board work that's going on at the moment. It's another of these very slow grinding restructures that's happening in health and social care, but it is supposed to be about place-based priorities. So it's just worth keeping an eye on that. I think the changes are, there's definitely, when public health firms came trotting over from the PCT to Brighton Hove City Council, it was like the people with the bags of gold had arrived, if I'm honest, because they had a lot of money with them, and they also had a different idea about how, you could invest in prevention and you could do stuff like that. And perhaps it's another of these hangovers that we have, is that we actually still think that that is the case. I think in all the time I've worked on sustainable food places, I would say it's the most likely supporter for the sustainable food places work has come from public health teams. And so they are, not always, I know some people have struggled, but they are often a very good starting point for policy influencing. Partly perhaps because they as well are a little bit different in terms of how they're looking at they're not so much about service delivery, they're sometimes more about the prevention agenda. Our public health team has been combined with our environmental health team. So they are the people who do the food safety inspections. It's been combined with some of the stuff around community safety and crime. I mean, it's gone really, really broad on its agenda, which then again means more people are pulling on its resources. I just also liked Rosie's question in here as to is it as simple as government not wanting to relinquish power? I think the answer to that question is going to be yes. I also think, though, it's not necessarily something that we when we're being political advocates or when we're campaigning, it's not necessarily something we remember to ask for. So it's like, if we'd like to see more localized food systems, perhaps one of the ways that gets achieved is through more localized power. Is perhaps not a sentence that always trips off as the second part of that sentence.
Thank you, Vic. Rebecca.
I'd like to follow on with that question, if that's okay. It's completely my nerdy area of interest. So yes, I mean, fundamentally, it is down to whoever is in power wanting to let go, and it is seen as, a letting go and a loss of control. But I think that is propped up by a lot of other things. So it's definitely not the only thing and it wouldn't solve it, but there's not a written constitution that enshrines some of these things like it does in other countries, particularly in Europe. Big fan of Britain. They're big fans of written constitutions in other countries where some of this can be kind of protected a bit more. There's an extremely strong control through the Treasury, and the Treasury has particular ways of measuring what it views as value for money on or return on investment that don't always match up with what they see the value of as a more localized approach. So there's something about how spending is controlled as well. Media and parliamentary cultures as well. So I'm from New Zealand, coming to the UK, the power of media was really eye-opening, and holding ministers to account for a specific thing is quite a big cultural point here. So one of our pitches is, give it to us and you won't have to be, shouted at the dispatch box when something goes wrong. But at the same time, ministers like pulling a lever to make something happen that looks good and supports that as well. And, who amongst us doesn't, right? It's nice to be able to feel like you can make things happen directly. And also, if you think of the way, I guess, power and decision making sits, if you think about it as a triangle where lots of the decisions are made up in that top bit, they just can't listen to very many people or hear very many stories or gain an understanding of how things work in a really deep way. But that also means the power of people to be able to influence those decisions is similarly quite limited. So the people who are talking to the people at the point of the triangle quite like having that relationship, don't they? So if that relationship or those decision-making points get more dispersed, it's much harder to influence some of those big national decisions as well. So there's a lot of vested interest in some ways in keeping a very centralized decision-making system in the UK. So yeah, if anyone can just slip those messages in about, more local decision-making would be better for all of us, actually, that would be delighted. We don't have any like LGA merch anymore. I can't send you anything nice, but you'd have our thanks very much.
Thank you. Oh, Emily, do you want to add something to that last question before we move on?
I just want Eva's question as well. Apologies, my internet might be a bit unstable, so please shout at me if I start to break up or anything. To say that as a council, actually, it seems quite interesting. Local authorities under the Localism Act, we actually have this thing called the General Power of Competence, which basically means we can pretty much do stuff as long as it's not against the law. So we have all our statutory responsibilities, so the stuff we have to provide, and we've got to do the bins and the housing and the planning service, those things. But we can also choose to do stuff. And actually, I suppose the kind of limiting factors in that are the things I've talked about already, the money and the political will as well. But actually, we have quite a lot of power to do stuff if that's what we choose to do, and if we're really clear about that. But I think one of the things that really upsets me about the way systems work at the minute, I suppose one of the things that I would love to see much better at is a bit about what Vic talked about the preventative spend. It's so much better to spend the money earlier on to prevent somebody falling into homelessness or food poverty, and to prevent those issues, to prevent obesity, rather than pay for the cost of diabetes, which is costing billions literally to our health service. Those services are actually really good value, but they're quite hard to show the evidence on, aren't they? It's really hard to show the value of what doesn't happen, and we've never been very good at that, and we're worse than ever at it at the moment, I think, because everybody's so stretched that we're all picking up pieces when what we'd like to do is stop stuff falling apart in the first place. So one of the arguments that I think really helps councils to take that kind of more innovative action is when you have some evidence about how it's going to save us money. And I know that's been where some of this, when I worked at Brighton Hove Food Partnership, so that was where some of our stuff landed quite well. It's when we've got evidence about the cost of a service and how it might save some money for that service, because that actually means that we feel more able to afford to do it in these stretched times. So that's a kind of you know, I think if you can frame stuff around the benefits for the council that and any cost savings, that really, really helps. And you know, food growing is a great example of that, isn't it? Because there's now such a strong evidence base compiled at both local and national levels that basically if food growing was a drug, it would be on prescription for depression, mental and physical health. So those kinds of arguments work really well because we've really got our eye on the cost factor. Thanks.
Thank you. Really powerful words. Look, we have 2 minutes left to the hour, so I would like to ask you in turn to leave your top tip for everyone in the meeting here that is starting to work with their council. Imagine a situation where there's no reference to food in any documents. What would be your top tip for those starting? Emily.
I think have a look. I know it's scary, but have a look at what's going on with your council's planning. Lots of areas are producing new local plans or reviewing them, and there is actually a lot. If you can bear to get past the kind of geekiness of it all, there's actually a lot of scope for influencing planning policy. But doing it at the point in which that's being consulted on is the point to do it. There's no point in responding to planning applications and things like that way down the line. It's got to be about the point you're making local planning policy. And I think if that's not something you've looked at doing, it's really worth taking a look at. And lots of places have done stuff, so it's not starting from scratch.
Vic?
I'll go next. I think given there's so many things you can do, I would say if you've got a local community, and I mentioned our community researchers earlier today, we've done a series of focus groups with people around asking questions about what policies they would like to see change, okay? And I think being able to shorten your list down by asking the communities you work with actually what bothers them the most, what worries them the most, and then taking those 3 and go and finding yourself a couple of champions within the local authority, because you are coming then with the absolute credibility of your community on your shoulders. So I would say go with what people that you are connecting with really want to see happen.
Thank you. Rebecca, any top tips before we close today?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. Someone's lurking outside my room. Talk to lots and lots of people and find your ways in. I think that the flip side of what Vic was saying is that know what you want to take to them, find the people who will listen and start there and see where it takes you. And good luck.
Thank you so much again for bringing your skills, experience. Thank you, Rebecca, Vic, and Emily. It was really valuable, I hope. So final reminder to please fill in our feedback survey so we can improve the format and delivery of future sessions. Hope this was useful, everyone, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you.